Good evening and good night to those of you who have stayed with us that far. This is the last panel of a very exciting day, and we appreciate you being here and know you will find it rewarding. We've saved the best for last. And after having heard and see so many examples and critical thoughts of the ways in which technology can help create more equitable cities, we are finally here to talk about the who and the where, about decision making makers and decision making processes and decision making environment. Since we are the last panel, we have decided to go on a little different or slightly different format to keep you awake and engaged. We will have shorter presentations, like 8-minute presentation, and then a round table structure in which we will ask questions and talk about them together. I'll just have a quite quick overview of the speakers. Nima Kudva, an associate professor at the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University, will be opening the session and framing it by asking how can planners and decision makers use technology based on specific location, or to think about the specific location. Christine Lundberger, a Fulbright specialist and a senior lecturer at the Department of Science and Technology Studies, will be talking about the rise of exclusionary technologies such as wall fences and barriers along borders and within cities, and how the COVID-19 pandemic provides an opportunity to rethink how we employ scientific and community generated expertise to inform policy in order to further social to further social and spatial justice and the right to the city. Following here, we will have example from the decision maker, the real decision maker themselves, Hagit Nahali and Shalevet Yosef. Both of them are director and senior partner planners at the strategic planning department at Tel Aviv. They will be talking about how Tel Aviv municipality bounced back and responded to the COVID-19 by developing new technology tools to help elderly in the city. And finally, to sum up this day, Bat-El Yosef, a PhD student from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at Technion, will sum up this panel and this day, a very important job you got, Bat-El, by showing us a real-time example of a decision-making environment that then can help bridge this gap between organizations, decision makers, and the public. So without further ado, Nima.
Okay, let me start. I'm just going to put a timer on so I don't go way over. And I need to share my screen. Oops. Okay, you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you, Sharon, and the organizers for inviting me and for this wonderful conference. And let's see, when I started to put my presentation together after some conversations that we'd been having as a panel, I had kind of thought that I would highlight some propositions which really sort of, address the panel that we came together to do. And now I can't get my slides to work there. And so this is what I was thinking about. But then as I sat through this day today, starting in the morning, my WhatsApp had this funky little diagram of an architect and everything that they have to keep in mind while they're sitting on their table, and I'm sitting there listening to everybody. They were fascinating. I figured I should actually maybe do, I'd like to restructure my slides a little bit to think more about sort of the conversations that I was starting to have with all the various And so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start, I think, with distinguishing planning, sort of like the big P planning and the little p planning, which we do as planners often. I know there's a lot of urban tech professionals here, but a planning which is futures oriented is very different from a planning that's everyday place maintenance. And the two require, they have different inclinations, different sensibilities, different problems to solve, different things to take care of. And I think, so many of the conversations today, like Harold's XR or Wendy's sort of fascinating stuff on the car, vis-a-vis Ryan Thomas's conversation on sort of informality and how do we really begin to think about it, or tech should not be automation, which is one of Carol's sort of provocations. All of these conversations begin to have a different balance if you start to look at planning in these kinds of ways. I think the other really important thing, especially in terms of my work, because I work on small cities across the global south and in communities that are sort of on the margins, is this question of center and peripheries that has also come up multiple times today. And where I really think about the center and the periphery, not just as spatial location, right? But I also want to really think about it as disciplinary location, as this question of what ideas become dominant, a Kuhnian sort of sense of paradigm dominance that we work against when we start to think about knowledge generation. And so, so Anthony's response to Wendy's sort of, this sort of conversation with Wendy on on the dominance of the Sun Belt and how there's a 250-mile sort of, like, the sense that I got, area that is beginning to generate all the knowledge on autonomous vehicles sort of comes to mind. And so, so when we start to look at planning in these ways, and we start to look at sort of the function of the planner, I think you begin to see the planner both as sort of in these peripheral locations, the parts of the world and places that I work in, as a critical thinker and a knowledge generator, right? Also in terms of futures, you're always being someone who's a knowledge generator. You're also a technical expert and you're a regulator. This came up quite a bit today. How do we think about regulation? And then, of course, if you're really interested in questions of access, voice, equity, you're thinking about the planner as a process manager and as a facilitator. So these are three very, very different skill sets. They require very different ways of thinking. And so what came up also, and I think it was Mirav who sort of, made this intervention about what so many of us are thinking about pedagogy. So many of us are thinking about how we train planners. And so for me, this question of planning as pedagogy, of learning by doing, in collaboration at different institutional scales, becomes quite central. And so, so I had structured sort of my talk, but I think it applies to so much of what all of us are thinking about, is how does one really think about collaborations, organizational practices, institutional structures for equity in practice. And so there are really three things that come up again and again, as I think several of us have sort of pointed to today. One is building out inclusive processes, right? In the very act of thinking about what one wants to do, how does one build in an inclusive process? And then in doing so, does that help us hone in on the appropriate questions to ask? Does that help us frame and envision what one wants to see? And this was, I keep coming back to sort of Karel's comments earlier today around these two questions, and Rit's sort of presentation on sort of rebooting New York City. And of course, every single one of us has been grappling with this question of how do we embed ethics, a practice of care, equity, and access in all these different structures and processes that we're putting into place. So how have I been doing this in my work? I use Cornell as my living lab, right? And in the past decade, I've been involved in setting up the Nilgiris Field Learning Center and in working there. It's an engaged research and learning project. It is created in collaboration with the Indian NGO, the Keystone Foundation, that works with indigenous communities in the Nilgiris, which was the first UN declared global biosphere. So it's all about sustainability, and it's about working across these 7 binaries. This is a bilingual program, and we educate both Cornell students from across the majors and young people from the Nilgiris. And it's, like I said, it's in Tamil and English. And so I won't go into these binaries in any great detail, but the ways in which tech comes into it as we work through questions of transdisciplinarity, work across time scales, work across these sort of categorizations of what's rural, what's urban, etc., is a lot of it is around archiving, mapping, and of course, creating a data ecosystem, right? And so a lot of it is around that, and questions of how those sorts of curations and creations allow for inclusion and access in the decisions that are made in this part of the world. So my work in the Nilgiris has shaped the direction of my teaching in particular, and this is a course that I teach, which is required of all our master's students who have come to Cornell to become professional planners. And so what do I try and do here? I'm trying to constantly destabilize the category of the city, right? I'm constantly trying to walk that line between what's at the center, what's at the periphery, how does it land in the center from the periphery. And so we talk always about the city of theory and history, the city of experience, and the future city. And we interrogate it through cases, which they have to pick up a case that they're not at all familiar with in a country they don't know, and also their home city, something that they know really well. So we try and embody experience in different ways. So just a little example of what this kind of navigation means. Think Chicago in the early 20th century when America was turning urban. This is where we get our sort of social ecological models of the city. It's embedded in our brains, Burgess, Park, Worth, and everybody else. At the same time that Burgess and Park were doing their sort of theorizing of the city, Jane Addams had a phenomenal set of work from Hull House, which talked about the feminist city and the immigrant city. It disappears. It appears in the work of Dewey, but otherwise it goes away. And oh my God, my time is up. So and while Jane Addams is doing that, W.E.B. Du Bois is writing The Philadelphia Negro and is talking about a Black Chicago. And the historical sociologist Chad Heap has talked about how queer Chicago is documented in the archives. So this is how we sort of bring the question into education. And as one is doing all this, we get hit by the pandemic, by Black Lives Matter protest movements, and I have a series of other projects that I wanted to talk about that I can address later in our Q&A, sort of in the time when we come back to the roundtable about institutions that we're creating at Cornell, thinking about equity in practice collaboratively with groups of people in AAP, and how the process begins to get defined. How do you bring this in? How do you design a virtual engagement process? And what is fascinating for me actually was the ways in which the Living Action Plan that we designed so paralleled in terms of how it thought about action, how it identified who was responsible, how it embedded accountability and redress into the plan itself, from the Rebooting New York City work that we heard about earlier today. I'm going to end by returning back to this question of experience and what it means. And I want to sort of go back to it and to think about this question of access, right? We think if we bring in people into a process, it opens up questions of access. But like Karel and Jenny sort of raised earlier this morning, I am fascinated by what remains obscured and what sorts of masses, our masses of data, what do they hide, and what it might say if we're truly going to think about an equitable and just planning. So thank you for putting up with me as I rush through everything.
Thank you, Nima. That was amazing, the way you connected a lot of the talks today. Really a nice way to look at everything at the end of the day. And we will move forward to Shalhevet Weissner, who will be talking together or not together with Hagit Nahali Yosef, Director of the Strategic Planning Department, Tel Aviv-Yafo Municipality, and Senior Planner and Urban Designer, Strategic Planning Department, Tel Aviv-Yafo Municipality. Shalhevet.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting us. I have to apologize on behalf of Hagit Nahali Yosef, who couldn't make it to the session, but I'm going to present on behalf of the Strategic Planning Department, which Hagit is the director of, and I recently started working in after working for a few years in London. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. Right. So just to start, like we said before, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated longstanding inequalities in cities and countries across the world, leading decision makers to act quickly and respond in innovative ways to the crisis. Tel Aviv, Yafo, and Israel have demonstrated how technology plays a key role in fighting and overcoming COVID-19, using existing digital platforms, improving them, and developing new ones. So, in spite of the terrible effects of COVID-19, the pandemic has, in a way, actually prepared us to respond to global risks and threats. Technology enabled us to develop local and national strategies more quickly through collaboration and engagement with professionals and researchers from academia, private stakeholders, including the tech industry, the public sector, and most importantly, local residents. And I'm going to show you a few examples now. So one of the first examples I would like to show is Digitel, which is an app that has been developed back in 2013 and is used by the municipality to maintain continuous contact with local residents. During the pandemic, the platform has been adapted to update residents on government guidelines and provide relevant information related to the rollout of vaccinations, the location of testing centers, updates on the education system, and guidelines for businesses that you can see all here. The next platform that I would like to speak about is Dashboard. So to track the spread of coronavirus across the city, the city's computer and IT department have developed a map-based coronavirus dashboard that you can see here. It's mapping out the spreading hotspots and providing important information and data on the number of people in quarantine, with emphasis on the number of elderly that you can see here, living in each district of the city who are the most vulnerable to COVID-19. Another dashboard that was developed and is used as an internal dashboard is the welfare dashboard. And this screen snip here is dating back to March and April 2020, showing that Israel and so that was the time where Israel and Tel Aviv were under the first lockdown, and it's demonstrating that many citizens were calling, that's here the subject, we're calling the welfare department with inquiries relating housing. And that leads me to the next slide, which is because the welfare dashboard was actually used for us as a tool that was very helpful, because earlier in 2020, we started to develop our housing policy. So you can see here that in the housing survey, we already started to implement the information that we had. And after seeing how the issue of housing was very prominent in the welfare dashboard, it allowed us to overlay the data that we had from the dashboard with the data that we have collected from the survey on the percentage of residents who are worried that they won't be able to carry on living in their neighborhood. You can see here in dark green areas that are the most vulnerable, which is the southeast and some of Yafo. And the next slide that I'm going to show is another stream of work that the municipality is developing, in which we work on a regular basis with a vibrant startup community, supporting initiatives and projects that tackle inequalities of gender, race, religion, and disability. So this example is SafeUp, which is an app. It's a safety network for women to support them when they walk in public spaces. So I think very differently from everything that I've seen today, it appears that it's maybe more the side of what we do in the municipality as decision makers. But I think the question that I would like to raise is linking to Nima's point on collaboration. I I think we've seen amazing tools throughout the day. And my biggest question is how do we collaborate and how do we use these tools? Because in many cases for us decision makers and being part of the system, it's very difficult to implement these tools and use them. And I think this will be the key to success, because even when I started working for the GLA, which is the Greater London Authority, I was very surprised to see that the tools that I knew from private sector that were very technological and digital and very advanced are not always being used, not only because they don't have enough staff, but also because of how expensive they are. So I think for us here in this session, it would be very interesting to understand how we can overcome this and how we can collaborate better to use digital tools to actually impact the residents that live in our cities. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Shalevet. This is so important that you're raising this question, and I'll hope we'll have time to address that in a few minutes. I'm gonna move forward to introduce Christine. She's going to talk about, or the title of the presentation is Beyond Walled Spaces, Transforming Policies of Exclusion with Policies of Inclusion. Christine, I can see you.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, and everyone for coming together and for us to have this transdisciplinary conversation. I think it's just so incredibly valuable, and also to have a conversation that is also bringing together community stakeholders with policymakers and academics. This is where we have to be right now. So I am working at the intersection of sociology, science and technology studies, and border studies. And over the last few years, I had one project that deals particularly with the rise of new exclusionary technologies ever since 1989. As we all know, of course, 1989 is a historic moment because that is when the Berlin Wall fell, and we thought that we would have an open, globalized world without any of these technologies of division. But instead, actually, that date and that year brought about a renaissance of walls, a new era of walls. And as you can see from the map on the right there, we've seen a rapid increase in wall and fence technology being used all around the globe in different national contexts. And September 11th has also contributed to that increase enormously, because at that point, borders were increasingly defined as a security threat rather than as a place where there could be cultural exchange and trade. So, as a result, we have more of these bordering mechanisms, not only along national borders, but also within cities. So it's been a global phenomenon. It's not only contained to Israel or the US-Mexico border. You can see you can see this trend happening in Far East Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Europe, in other places. So Saskia Sassen, who is a sociologist at Columbia University, tried to explain this rise of exclusionary infrastructures in terms of the increased inequality that transpired as a result of globalization post 1989. And if we look now at the city in particular, we find that, of course, there's always been inequality, but the inequality has increased over the last 30 years. So historically in US City in particular, of course, we have very segregated communities. We have ethnic enclaves, and that is something that Jennifer Meener has also talked about earlier. And of course, that impacts access to housing, access to welfare services, access to education, access to healthcare. So that in itself is already incredibly problematic. But now we also have the rise of gated communities in the US, but also in Israel and other places. So the data that I got for the US, unfortunately, it's not up to date. It hasn't been updated since 2015, is that we now have about what is it, 11 million units in walled and fenced secured communities. And this is a trend that is continuously increasing. And it is increasing in an era where we do have structural inequalities in the cities. And Oren Iftachel and his colleague Rockham, Jonathan Rockham, also talked about the increase in vertical and horizontal polarization. So the socioeconomic inequalities are becoming more intense, but also the horizontal polarization between rural and urban communities. So we have more and more spatial and racial fragmentation, which then goes along what Peter Sherlock called ethno-sectarianism, which of course is detrimental to building an inclusive and equitable society. And that ethno-sectarianism sort of goes alongside what some geographers have called the geography of fear. So we are fearful of neighborhoods that supposedly contain the other, and then the ethno-sectarianism sort of reinforces the structural inequality in the city, the spatial inequality. And of course that impacts the right to the city. It impacts right-based urban development. And as I mentioned earlier, and many people today have mentioned, it impacts access to education and healthcare and employment. And on the right-hand side, you see, for instance, a map of the DC area where I spent quite some time. The different colors represent different ethnic groups that are obviously incredibly polarized and sort of spatially segregated from one another. So Arlington is primarily white, whereas other areas like Largo are primarily Black, and there is actually quite not very much interchange. Now the pandemic has been a sort of a wake-up call. And we actually have a colleague of ours in science studies now in the White House, Andrew Nelson. She's a sociologist and science studies scholar. And she pointed out something that, of course, a lot of you have also pointed out today, including Howard and Shalhevet, as well as Bob, that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the inequalities that we all have known about. We've known about it for years. And we've also known that infrastructures and technologies are political. We know about the politics of infrastructure and the politics of technologies, but oftentimes it does not, it's not used in policy. So in science studies, we have various sort of classic studies like the one by Landon Winner, Do Artifacts Have Politics? That speaks to the fact that all artifacts, all technologies have some sort of politics built into them. So there are social and political values built into the technologies and into the infrastructures in which we reside and with which we live on a day-by-day basis. And for instance, one contemporary example is I've done a paper on the Trump peace plan, which included a map of what the peace plan entitled The Possible Future State of Palestine. And there you have basically a fragmented territory that was supposed to become part of the state of Palestine, being linked up with bridges and tunnels. Now, of course, it's all couched in terms of access and in terms of making a contiguous territory for the Palestinians. But as we know from the literature, building bridges and tunnels in order to basically connect fragmented territories for the Palestinians is incredibly political, because a lot of scholars would say, well, it actually only legitimizes and normalizes the spatial segregation. So when we talk about access, we have to really carefully think about access to whom and what sort of access, and how are inequalities built into this notion of access. And there are various other studies, such as the one by Nolte and Jacobi, that look also at the politics of infrastructure. Like they looked at the Jerusalem Light Rail, which everyone who spent time in Jerusalem in the early 2000s knows how incredibly politicized the light rail is in terms of who has access to the light rail, who does it serve, which communities are served by the light rail. I don't have to go into detail also because we don't have time, but it is a wonderful example of the politics of infrastructure. So now Nelson, who is now at the White House, says that COVID-19 provides a call to arms for us to apply our scholarship and to draw links between the research, between what we know in academia, in the social sciences, and policy. And one of the action items is that we really need to rethink the role of expertise, and how do we really apply expertise to promote change, to address these structural spatial inequalities. We've got the expertise. We also had the expertise about inequality in health. So for instance, Governor Cuomo went on record early on in the pandemic saying, COVID is the great equalizer. As a social scientist, it made me cringe. We know that pandemics are not great equalizers. They're actually great unequalizers. They actually exacerbate the inequities. But somehow the message of the social sciences has not gotten out there. It's not been picked up when we were in the depths of this crisis. So there are two things that I think we need, and a lot of to my first point, a lot of that is being done by a lot of you. We need more community-driven, participatory approaches, and to partner with marginalized communities, to include them in the conversation, and to also take the cues from them about what is needed in these communities. And that applies to bordering technologies too. We need to go to the border and understand these communities and do sort of grassroots initiatives to really tackle the needs of the communities on either side of the border, whether that is Mexico and the US or whether it is West Bank and Israel. So only by having these sort of community-based and generated approaches can we try to build more just and inclusive and resilient communities, something that Mei-Jun also mentioned early on. And secondly, also we need more social science in policy. Actually, I was in the federal government as a science and policy fellow from 2016 to 2017, hoping to bring more social science to policy. And I know how difficult it is. I was at the US Department of State as well as at USAID, and it's not easy to translate science to policy, and it's certainly not easy to translate social science into policy, because in most of the agencies, people have no clue what social science is. So we also need to get the message out there, what we really can contribute to the conversation, and we need to be taken seriously. And the fact that we have Alondra Nelson at the White House now, who does look at science and race and how the health of different communities is impacted by the dominant structures, it's a first step. So the Biden administration is definitely a hopeful sign, because it is trying to do what Obama had done already, which is basically try to bring more science to policymaking. It was never perfect. It's not easy. It's very difficult to translate science into policy on the federal level. But for instance, the fact that Biden has appointed a science advisor to a cabinet level position is indicative that scientists have a new place at more important tables. So this is the time to get in there and really make a difference. And it's a way of trying to come up with more science-informed policies. I used the word science-informed policies, which is used by Sheila Jasnoff, rather than science-based policy, because in the federal policy making, science is never the only thing at the table. We need to look at the politics, we need to look at people's values and people's personal preferences, but science has a role to play. Science can inform policy, but it will never be the only thing that is informing policy. And we know, for instance, from border studies and from historical studies, but also from policy think tanks, as well as from studies done by the Congressional Research Service, for instance, that bordering and enclaving is detrimental to communities. Wall technologies have been studied, for instance, by Brent Sterling. He has looked at different walls during different historical periods, and he said they might have some short-term advantages, but in the long term, they're always detrimental to communities. And they certainly don't enhance justice and equity. So we need those sorts of studies, what we know about bordering, how it impacts borders on a national level, but also borders in the city. We need to get these studies out there, and we need to be able to inform policies based on what we already know. And that means bringing scientific expertise to policy, but also, just as importantly, community-generated expertise. So thank you so much. And I feel like a lot of these points speak to what so many of you have talked about throughout the day.
Thank you, Christine. I'm sure we'll be able to continue those important points after Bat-El's presentation. And you were talking about community engagement and the way to create opportunities for more people to participate in the decision-making process. And I think this is a great build-up to Bat-El's presentation. So Bat-El, the floor is yours. Yeah. Bat-El Yosef is a PhD student from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at the Technion. She's going to talk about an urban digital twin technology as a way to generate a new setup for decision-making environments.
I just need that Christine will close her share presentation.
Okay, yes, sure.
Okay, great, thank you. Just a second. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'm very excited to present on this panel as the last speaker of this unique day. I would like to thank you, Sharon, for organizing this symposium and leading this panel. My lecture topic is about offering a new platform for decision-making. I'm an architect by practice, and I have a master's degree in multidisciplinary study from Royal College of Art in London. My thesis focused on neighborhood planning as a democratic tool for inclusive growth. And today, I'm a PhD student being supervised by Dr. Merav Aharon-Gutman, and together we lead an applied research project called Smart Social Strategy. Our project is inspired by the digital and information area. In this video, we see an artwork created by Rafik Andur. This work presents New York collective memories from social media. By collecting all images together, they became big data. Our research is reflected to this work. We find this as illustration for data flooding that produced by smart city technologies. Our approach critiques smart city conceptions. We claim that smart city technologies almost completely ignore social issues when managing and planning the city. In contrast, we believe that social and local knowledge can be utilized by smart city technologies, and moreover, local community can be at the forefront of those technologies. Therefore, in our research, we promote a co-production approach, which is a collaboration between local municipality, public agencies, and academia. Our case study is a Dar neighborhood in Haifa, with a population of 40,000 residents for all religions and buildings from 100 years ago. The buildings and the urban infrastructures have declined, together with the population. The neighborhood suffers from neglection and it is considered as a low-income neighborhood. In the last few years, many young activists have started moving to the neighborhood and reshape it. We use urban digital twin as a tool for co-production. But what is urban digital twin and how does it shape a democratic approach for co-production? The digital twin is a common tool for engineering and design processes. It is a virtual representation of the physical object, which enables simulates of scenarios. In the recent year, the digital twin has generated popularity in the field of urban management. It gains smart city technologies such as traffic lights, CCTV, into one place. In our research, we are developing a digital twin which emphasizes social media. How we do it? We have different data layers as part of our co-production, and we integrate them into one 3D model. And here you can see our range of data sources. Our uniqueness is the local knowledge data layers. Since we work in partnership with local public agencies, we are able to collect and produce data via civic monitoring methods. Usually, a digital twin is located exclusively in a virtual environment, such as Web Generation 2. As well as a virtual environment, we also facilitate a physical environment based on ideas of interactive collaboration. Our physical environment integrates two types of experience. The first is the visual experience, which is the ability to see the space, the neighborhood, and the social issues. And the second is the interactive experience, which is the ability to touch the model and to navigate into the virtual digital twin. Our environments take inspiration from two spaces. One is the command center based on collecting real-time data and visualization. And the second is the cave, a computer-assisted virtual environment, which is popular in academics for simulating different scenarios. Our physical environment combined tools from those two spaces. Our space is enabling real-time data collection and an immersive and interactive visual environment for social decision-making. Opening only 1 month ago, this is how our physical environment looks. We project our digital twin on concave wall that creates an immersive feeling. We also have interactive devices such as a multi-touch table in the center of the space, which enables collaboration between different stakeholders. And by doing this, we generate a new environment for social making. And here is some examples to our toolbox, which is very diverse and based on different methods and methodologies, such as civic monitoring and data-driven simulation. Our research took place only 1 year ago, and this year was unique. We deal with COVID pandemic and lockdowns. Our project has responded to those extreme situations. In the second lockdown, after 11 old people dying alone in their home, we managed a civic monitoring co-production operation. Our aim was to see the elderly Adar neighborhood population and their new needs. We built a technical infrastructure that support this process. The public agencies mapping the elderly population and Haifa municipality responds to their needs. And here you can see a dashboard and a digital application which we developed for this operation. Finally, it's very important to me introduce you our multidisciplinary team, which is leading the project together with me. By coming from different backgrounds, we have the ability to design creative and innovative solution for a unique platform for decision making, which is relevant to the digital area that we live in today. Thank you, and of course, we invite you to following us on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Thank you, Batel. It's so exciting to see your room in progress. I plan to visit Israel next month. I hope you can take me to see the room. So now for our final discussion, we want to ask questions about the who and the where after we heard from all the panelists in this session. And thinking about the who part of the equation, we heard, or I would like each of you to think out loud with us in the example you gave, whose voice and shapes get to be heard and what shapes are, or forms or voices are not being heard, who get to talk, who raises the questions, and who makes the decisions. How can we bring more people to talk, and how can tech work? Where does tech work and doesn't work in that equation of the who? And I also invite all the panelists that have stayed with us to this hour. You're welcome to open your screen and participate in this final discussion. But maybe we'll start with Nima to respond to the question about the who.
Sure. Thank you for that, Sharon. So I really do think so much of my work involves communities, and I'll start with the Nilgiris project. Tech's sort of really interesting because everybody has phones, right, in the communities we work with. And I just want to remind you, if you don't know about this, the indigenous groups in India, who we call the Adivasis, are amongst India's most marginalized communities. And we work with communities, some of whom have just come out of I think they were forest dwelling to maybe one generation ago. So the levels of poverty are quite striking. It's a horrible word to use, but that's how it is. And so this idea that there's broadband and smartphones is just a joke, right? Everybody has flip phones, don't get me wrong. Everybody has flip phones. But then the language question is huge. And so everything is in English, and there, the language of the state is Tamil, but some parts we go into Malayalam, and then in the indigenous languages are different. So who comes on the table is a really interesting question. And our strategy became that in working in the biosphere, we created a relationship first with the NGO. And the one of the founders of the NGO had come to Cornell as a Humphrey Fellow for a year, and so he went around talking to people. But it took us 3 years to put the project in place, and I actually really need people to understand that. 3 years to design the project, put the stuff in place, think about a curricular strategy, think about how we wanted to do it, think about funding. And then the really interesting part that I just want to sort of put out there is that we didn't do anything unless we got permission from the elders. But of course, the elders hold a certain kind of both, they hold wisdom and knowledge, but they also hold a certain process in place. And so there's been a lot of negotiation in terms of younger people. How does that work? You know, the younger people who join us for the program amongst the Adivasis, and then the elders vis-a-vis the younger people in the community. And that's one tension. And then the other tension is how the Adivasi do not want us to include anybody else. We've been repeatedly asked by other communities in the region to include them, and the elders have always refused. And so I think there's interesting dynamics. And of course, our partner NGO, right? When you think about now in this world with Zoom, you know, we communicate in completely different ways. There's no going there. Previously, we always went there. So there is still this question of place and of actually being there physically, you know, what it means in virtual engagement. So I'll stop there. I can go on and on and on, because there are other projects, you know, the Cornell ones where we included students in places that students don't normally show up in the faculty senate, for example. All our working groups for the Anti-Racism Initiative had students in them. And what that meant, we included staff, and that also is an unusual thing. So I can go on, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Nima. And I think, Bat-El, maybe you can respond to that, because the Who Get to Talk is also one of the things that leads the situation room that you're leading.
Merab, do you want to answer to this question? No. Okay. So, so in our case, since we work in co-production module, so around the table we have the Haifa local municipality and their different departure in the municipality, and we also have a Shachar Foundation, which is a foundation which is like organize many communities, and in neighborhood that we work, there are many activists that work there. So my feeling is that they're just waiting for some kind of organization can help them to shape their activities. And I know that is a unique situation because in other Israeli neighborhood is not the same, but in our case, this is the same. So it was like a very good area to work in.
Thank you. And also, Shalhevet, I think maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you can bring different voices into the decision making when you're working in the city.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. It's quite like the biggest question, especially after COVID-19. We realized that even when we want to engage with the public, tech kind of limits us to how we can engage with people that are more vulnerable, that don't have the access to technology in the same way. And I'm just thinking and kind of linking back to the presentation that we had in the previous panel, is that whether maybe technology can, with simulations, start and predict how some people that don't have the access would react or want to engage. Because even with the housing survey that I presented or other surveys that we have, we sometimes experience situation in which the data that we collect is lacking, especially in areas where we have vulnerable communities. So that almost like gives us the wrong picture. So we can only estimate based on past predictions and based on what we know, how these vulnerable communities would react and why they were not able to answer to such a survey. And just wondering whether technology could actually assist in a way to make these predictions in the future, because it's difficult for me to see other ways of how we do it.
Right.
Well,
Thank you.
can I ask a question?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Merav.
I want to ask Christine a question, and maybe to respond to things that you, Nima, just said. I have this ongoing conversation with some of my colleagues, mainly from Europe, that deals with social planning, and they keep arguing that you know, the people, the middle low class people have no access to technology, and the platform that we develop is far too high for them to use. And I am amazed by this because, as you said, everybody has smartphones today, and not only that, when we come to groups of people that live in places that there are no infrastructure, we see much more use in technology than in other places. For example, the Bedouins of the Negev, which are kind of native nomadic group that live in Israel, have solar panels because they have no electricity. And there are so many examples. So I feel like we need to break together this approach, saying that technology and society can't go hands in hands together. And the other thing that you said, Christine, regarding the coronavirus, if the pandemic brings us to be more equal or unequal, I think this is a very interesting discussion, and maybe we can write about it together, because I think it's go to all directions. Of course, somebody that live in density, in dense apartments, big family, they suffer a lot from coronavirus, etc. And there are so many examples for that. But at the same time, in Israel, and I know that in other places, because it's a pandemic and it's so affected, the governments took responsibility about all the groups in the society, because it is a moment of awareness that you can handle the situation if you will deal only with one group. There was a huge discussion in Israel. The government really worked deep into the low classes, make sure that they will get the infection, make sure that they have food during the lockdowns, etc. The thing that, of course, to come into discussion is about the Palestinians that live in the Palestinian Authority, whether Israel has a responsibility to give them infection, etc. That was a huge discussion. But Jews and Arabs alike that live inside the borders of Israel, it was no question.
Yeah, so I think it would be very interesting to actually compare the ability of the Israeli government to cater to the needs of different majority and minority communities versus the US, which has completely failed in this respect. So, I mean, not only do we have you know, the resource rich now being primarily vaccinated, but and the resource poor and not having equal access to vaccines, but also the impact of the pandemic was felt obviously much more in resource poor communities because of the inability to cater our resources effectively for these communities. So I mean, I'm in Ithaca, so I feel like I was in a very privileged community, but you know, other communities in New York City were affected much more intensely, and we have not dealt with this in an equitable fashion. So I think comparing the two national contexts would be very interesting, because it sounds like Israel has had some best practices there that we could learn from.
It's actually a very important issue about the different structure of the city, or the state, sorry, like the difference between a welfare state and a capitalist state. But we have a questions from one of the attendees, Lily Chi, who was participating from the beginning of the conference. So I want to raise her question and hear your thoughts about it. She's asking on this question of who is heard, etc. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on the relationship between state power and the institutional basis of research, knowledge, education. So it is very relevant to what Christine was talking about, and also about what you were just starting to talk about the state, or the role of the state in this kind of decision making.
So should I address this question first? So, I mean, having actually worked in the state, having worked at the Department of State as well as at USAID, I think one thing that is important to keep in mind, the state is not just the state. It's not a homogeneous state. So we have all these different agencies, and we have all these different bureaus within particular agencies, and we have many, many different interests being pushed, not only by different agencies, but across different bureaus. So there's a lot of conflicting agendas, portfolios, and we need to understand the production of knowledge contextually, not only in terms of, for instance, a particular bureau, but also in terms of the bureau's network to other bureaus within the federal government, but also to outsiders, to academics, to think tanks. So it's not a sort of a self-contained unit, but it's a networked unit, and we have to sort of understand these networks in order to understand how different types of knowledge are generated.
You know, if I could just add something, I think another very important way of understanding the state and its relationship to places that one works in is that state categorization and policies direct financial flows, right? Any kind of input. And this doesn't have to be only just for a welfare state. I mean, think of India. If you're categorized as a census town, as opposed to a village panchayat, as opposed to a town panchayat, as opposed to a municipal corporation or a municipality, your taxation, how you tax the local area is different. How much money you get in state funds is different. And so places of the same size sometimes make choices of what happens, which kind of categorization they would prefer. And so, or elected officials make certain decisions, or bureaucrats make certain decisions. And these decisions begin to have huge impacts in terms of funding flows, right? And so the state can be absent in terms of your everyday planning. It provides no water, it provides no shelter, it provides no support. But on the other hand, the state is hugely present because it is producing the categories by which policy making happens, which allows, you know, even what's urban and rural to be decided, and it's different from place to place. So I do think the state, you know, thinking about the state, the political state, the administrative state, the networked state, the local state vis-a-vis the federal state, all of those pieces is quite important when we think about a place, any place. And how it begins to work. I just want to add one other point if nobody else wanted to jump in on infrastructure. Does somebody else want to say something? I don't want to dominate.
Actually, we have a response from Rachel Alterman. She is a scholar at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning, and she's writing that regarding the proposed comparative research, I agree with Merav that in the Israeli case study, the pandemic may have had a positive distributive effect. However, comparison with the US or even New York State are two extremes along several dimensions. And I propose to add 2-3 European countries in the team. Interested, I will share the specific of the comparative dimension I have in mind. Broadly, there are spatial, macroeconomic, political, and importantly, demographic. So that's an interesting thought that we can think about maybe tomorrow during the workshop also. And I want to take the discussion into the where part of the equation. We heard about the where in different ways, right? Nima talked about the connection between technology and place through the examples that she gave. And we heard about technical environment that are about places like the digital twin. We've also heard about borders and walls from Christine. And I invite you to think about the fine line that marks the boundary between technology as a tool for helping people and technology as a tool to democrate the borders or eliminate access of people to places. from the examples or the research that you worked on? Like, is technology a boundary, or is it a tool?
Dawn, it's after midnight here, and your questions are so sophisticated that I find it hard to follow.
I'm sorry.
No, no, Sharon, I would, yeah, no, go ahead. Somebody else wanted to say something.
I wouldn't mind just jumping in here very quickly. I have a paper on actually the separation barrier between the West Bank and Israel, which of course, again, is a very politicized infrastructure. And the barrier there is interesting because not only do Palestinians map it very differently to Israelis, and international cartographers map it again very differently, depending on the politics that inform the actual mapping of the barrier, but also the barrier itself by Palestinians is mapped and perceived and experienced as actually a source of insecurity, and of course as inhibiting freedom of movement and inhibiting access, whereas for some Israelis it is perceived as a source of security. So you have an example of an infrastructure that based on the perspective from some social groups is seen as increasing security, and other groups as something that provides actually insecurity. So we need to really look at who is perceiving this infrastructure, is experiencing that technology, and how are they impacted. So that the technology in and of itself is not neutral, but it is embedded within a particular geopolitical context and social experience. So anyway, over to you, Nima.
No, I was just going to actually say exactly the same thing in a different context, right? I really think, Sharon, depending on the context you're looking at, you're always going to have this double-edged kind of question, this perspective or outcome based on whose perspective you're really taking up, right? So, for example, in the communities that we work with in the Nilgiris, a lot of them go in and out of the forests, and there's a whole bunch of tracking that happens within forests, right? And they're not meant to go in and collect certain kinds of non-timber forest produce, or they're not supposed to poach. Well, they're not supposed to hunt, which is seen as poaching by the forest department. And so there are, I think, real encroachments in terms of people's livelihoods that begin to happen because the state and forests are seen in particular ways, right? So every piece of it you begin to have, depending on the perspective of the person looking at the question, a different story that comes up. And for me, that's quite fascinating, actually. So the tool, like Christine said, is never apolitical. It becomes political in how it begins to be used.
Right.
I think for me, it's just, I would say it probably needs to be a combination of both, because as technology can be a boundary, but it could also be something that connects. We all see it now with COVID-19, like we're having this conference on Zoom. We're trying to do engagement and participation through Zoom, but some people don't have the access. Right. And I think even with we're enjoying working from home, but we also enjoy interaction. So I think, to me, the technology is just a tool, but it can't stand on its own. It has to come as accompanied with some interaction. And I think what Patel showed us is exactly that: is technology in a way that engages with people that are actually in a room and are making discussions together.
I want to have a hard stop right here, because I think what you just said is like a great final remark for these days. I also feel for the people in Israel. It's another way of imposing power from the right, from the Americas into the peripheries, or to the global south, although Israel is not part of it. But yeah, we are imposing our timeline on the Israeli academia. So I apologize for that. And we will stop this amazing day right now. Hopefully we will reconvene tomorrow morning to have a more intimate conversation and to continue exactly where we stopped here. And I'm just going to give Sharon Shachaf the final words to talk about what we're going to do tomorrow. And if we have some of the panelists still with us, it would be nice to say goodbye. You're welcome to open your cameras. So
all right, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right, well, hi everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to be the fly on the wall today in your fascinating conversation. As the day progressed, I was just taking it all in, and I feel like I know a lot more right now about your diverging fields. And also, I mean, well, that's a total aside, and I'm not trying to take a lot of your time right now, but as a global media scholar myself in my background and training, there were so many of these conversations that overlap and it's fascinating to me. So without further ado, and to be very quick, I will just want to, extend an invitation for all of you, of course, those of you who signed up to come, but even those of you who haven't, to join us tomorrow. We have three fantastic editors here, Sharon, Milav, and Jennifer, who are plotting to get a product out of this collaboration, and we did end up putting in the driver's seat an anthology and a collection. So tomorrow we're going to center around brainstorming and field mapping and some activities, and a lot of you have been doing this in this panel, so you actually made my work easier for tomorrow. You started weaving together the threads that bring together your very diverse questions, your diverse methods. And also you started doing another thing that I hope we would do tomorrow, which is to start, pointing at gaps. Who is not included in the conversation? Who do we need to include? Now, my claim for academic glory actually resides, you never know which of the things you would do would be the most successful. I have an award-winning edited collection, and so I can speak, and I'm sure a lot of you edited collaborative work before, but I can definitely speak to the, the function of a good field defining, path-breaking anthology, and how that particular product, although even in our earlier conversations, everybody involved already thought of, many different kind of products. Obviously, seeing today in all the presentations and the simulations, we thought about that, but then we end up saying, a book can become a platform for a lot more products, right? So under the umbrella of a book, you could have an exhibit, you can have, other things. So we're going to, try to put the book in the driver's seat, and we're going to do a process-oriented workshop. We're going to try to create a space where we are allowed to explore. We are allowed to get it wrong. We are allowed to think out loud. And I know this is counterintuitive for the academic culture sometimes. It seemed to me that, actually watching today, you guys are pretty good at collaborations and seem to be very generous with each other. So I'm hoping to bring in, this creative, juicy flow that I saw building throughout the day into tomorrow's workshop. And again, the idea is simple. We want to, give you the stage so that you guys gain clarity about this possible collaboration, and how, hopefully we can end up with at least a provisional table of content. We might do some exercises about competing tables of content, and we will, try to see what is the best kind of core thread that can bring together best all of your wonderful projects and work. And I definitely, I don't want to, everybody's tired, so I'm not going to start naming all the different methods and the different theoretical and conceptual frameworks and the different questions and the different topics that were opened up today. But the idea is to bring that richness and then find a way to move forward with what would hopefully, be a field-defining anthology. But for that, you will do some work in defining, what is that field that you guys are, if we're bringing all of you together, so that maybe that's a great way to stop and leave you with this question, right? If we want to take this fantastic day and think about your convergence as, you trying to forge ahead in a leadership role for your field, how would you define that goal? What would you want a product like that to look like? What questions would you want it to ask? What topics have to be covered? And what are the gaps? Because I don't want to be the person to say, I'm not seeing, right? I don't spy with my little eyes that you have someone from here or you have that theory, and also I'm a layperson. So I know everybody here is deeply invested in bringing together the most diverse, most inclusive group of scholars. So, again, that would be where I bow out and say, we will think about all these things tomorrow. So come ready to, also have some fun. Might I suggest, we want this to be fun. We did the conference thing. I'm sure everybody's I feel like telling everybody to take a deep breath and roll their shoulders back because you did it. You did great. I was very impressed with each and every one of you. Now let's leave aside any remaining need to, posture. Not that I'm saying that anybody specifically did that, right? But in a conference, we have to bring our A game and be like, I am this. And bring in the ability and the willingness to think out loud, get it wrong, because this is where the creative magic begins to happen. All right, so Meirav, tell me if I'm missing something big here.
Thank you so much.
You're doing good.
Awesome,
Are you
awesome.
going to be together tomorrow?
I'm sorry?
I'm asking Nama if
sorry.
she's going to be tomorrow. But Sharon, I think I pronounced her name not in
Nima?
Oh, what was that?
Meirav was
I just
asking
want
you.
to ask if you are going to be tomorrow in the workshop, because actually you started today to bring things together. And
Yeah, no,
thought
I think I
maybe
did sign up for it. I have to go look. I think I did sign up for it.
Yes, you did.
great.
Yeah.
That's what I actually wrote, Meirav, I wrote Nima behind the scene. And I was like, you did my work, you made my work easy for tomorrow with your, I was very impressed. And I was like, I hope you better come. So hopefully,
No, I look forward to it. I think these are very important questions. It's just that the locations where we work in are so radically different, right? I don't hear anyone talking. It's so interesting to me. The Israelis all have. Your web is in Hebrew.
Yeah.
India, it's so difficult. I can't tell you.
I
can
think
write
that's
to
a
our
great
government in 29 languages. You show me. Google can't. The language, my mother tongue, Google doesn't even recognize.
This is a fantastic. You see, that's a gap.
So this business of I don't think we should be. I know it's really interesting. I'm sort of struck actually. We don't have so much from the South here, and that really changes the conversation. But anyway, we should do it tomorrow. It's so late for you guys. You go to bed.
Right. Okay. I'm going to cut everything now and say
Yes.
good night to everyone.
Nice.
Good evening to the
Good
people
night.
in New York and Ithaca. Thank you, all the attendees. Thank you, the panelists. It has been a wonderful, fascinating, and incredibly rich day. And I hope we can continue this conversation tomorrow and in the future with all of you, the attendees. With that, I'm going to say good night to everyone.
Sharon, I want to
Thank
say
you so
thank
much,
you.
Sharon.
Everyone. Yeah.
Sharon,
Bye-bye.
I want to say thank you for you, of course, and for Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you for
Right.
being a team with us and leading.
I've done so little compared to you two and Sharon and what Sharon will do tomorrow. So thank you for involving me. And this has been a fascinating panel. I wish we had everyone had been able to present at the very beginning so that we had the widest audience. I'm glad that you're recording, and I hope that we can tap that.
Yeah.
And see you tomorrow. Sorry.
We will post everything on the website and then Cornell Hub, Tech Hub website afterwards, so it will be available.
Thank you.
Sorry, my children are starving, so I have to leave.
Oh my God, they
Bye-bye.
stay up. Okay, good night.
Good night.
Good night,
Bye,
friends.
good
See you
night.
Thank you
tomorrow.
all.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.